that we are all looking forward to trying to finish our legislative work this week. The Majority Leader has announced that next week the Senate would be in recess for the Memorial Day traditional recess. But let me just urge our colleagues that before we leave for the recess, we need to act on the challenges that COVID-19 is imposing on our state and local governments. To me, it would be irresponsible for us to leave and go into recess recognizing that our state and local governments are so much impacted by COVID-19. They are making decisions now. They have to put their budgets together. They have to adjust this year's budget and plan for next year's budget. And what's in the balance? Well, it's for our municipalities, it's law enforcement, it's police, it's fire, it's emergency rescue. For our counties, it's our schools and funding of our schools. It also deals with public health. For our state, it's public health and so many other different issues that are dependent upon the state having the resources in order to respond to the needs of their citizens, our constituents, as well as to deal with the challenges of COVID-19. I'll just give you one example. I met this week by teleconference with representatives of our higher education, University of Maryland. They depend very much on the revenues they get from the state and the revenues they get from their students. Both are very much in jeopardy today. The least we can do is to make sure that the states have the resources to continue these critical missions, and they just don't have it. Let me just give you some of the numbers just so my colleagues are aware of it. For the state of Maryland, the revenue projections are that for the current fiscal year that ends June 30, that their revenues will be off by as much as $925 billion to $1.125 billion. That's revenue losses. And put on top of that, that their FY22 revenue projections are another loss of $2.1 to $2.4 billion. That's the state of Maryland. That's not our subdivisions. Baltimore City is projecting a reduction in revenues by $142 million in this year. That's going to require layoffs, and they've already talked about layoffs, and not hiring additional police officers. Those police officers are needed in order to keep Baltimore safe. We know of the challenges we have in our municipal centers, and Baltimore City is under a consent order, a decree. So that's being jeopardized by the inability of Baltimore to deal with these costs. They have to balance their budget. The state of Maryland has to balance its budget. Baltimore City has to balance its budget. It doesn't have the leeway we have in order to respond to a crisis by pumping money at a problem. Baltimore County, $172 million revenue projection. That's a 22% reduction in this year's budget in regards to income tax revenues alone, and a 70% reduction in motel and hotel tax revenues. For Montgomery County, our neighbor, borders here in D.C., a $250 million projected revenue loss for this year. Prince George's County, $134 million revenue loss for this year. That includes a reduction of $886 million in income tax revenues. Anne Arundel County, $63 million loss of revenue. They've frozen all positions. Howard County, $30 to $40 million loss of revenue. They normally have a growth of $25 million. So that's a swing of $55 to $65 million for a county that wasn't large enough to get direct help under the CARES Act. I mentioned the CARES Act because it was an important bill. When we first took it up, it did not include a robust provision for state and local. We put that in on the Senate floor, and we're pleased that we're able to do that. But it is limited. How is it limited? The money that we made available under the CARES Act provided help to state and local governments on their direct costs associated with COVID-19. That money has been used for direct costs associated with COVID-19. I've already pointed out the revenue losses in the state of Maryland and in our subdivisions. The CARES Act does not provide any help in regards to making up for the revenue losses. The CARES Act only went to jurisdictions of 500,000 or more, over 500,000. So in my state, only a few of our counties were eligible for help. Most of our counties were not eligible for help directly. They had to apply through the state, but they were not eligible for direct help. Well, let me just give you one county, Wicomico County on the eastern shore of Maryland. That's where the poultry processing plants are located. And that's where the problems of COVID-19 needed to be contained. We did not provide any direct help to Wicomico County in regards to stabilization funds. That was wrong. And as we all know, we treated where we are here, our host jurisdiction, the District of Columbia, wrongly by not allowing them to get the same minimum distribution as a state. So the CARES Act helped, but it didn't deal with the current crisis that we now find at state and local government. So the governors have issued a bipartisan plea. Governor Hogan, who's the chair of the National Governors Association, the Republican governor from Maryland, and Governor Cuomo, the governor from New York, a Democrat, have joined with all of our governors in saying they need help now from the federal government in order to maintain critical missions of public safety, of public health, of education, and yes, to meet the direct needs related to COVID-19. They need help now. And yes, we need to respond. I am pleased that there's a bipartisan group of senators that have filed the SMART Act. The governors say they need $500 billion in order to get through this immediate crisis. $500 billion more. Well, the SMART Act provides $500 billion. Two-thirds would go to the state and one-third to the local governments. That's an important start. But we could do better than that. The HEROES Act, the bill that passed the House of Representatives, provides $875 billion. 57% goes to the states, meeting what the states need. That's basically the states' needs. 42% goes to local government, half to the counties, half to municipalities over 50,000. That would go a long way to meeting the needs of our local first responders, our police, our fire, our emergency rescue, our schools. Those types of issues could be addressed under that need. We've got to respond. We just can't go home and say this is not our problem. These are our constituents. They depend upon local police and fire. They depend upon the schools being prepared to educate their children. They depend upon sanitation being collected. They depend upon the public health capacities. That's where they get those services. And if we don't provide the wherewithal under the balanced budget rules, they're not going to be able to provide those essential services. So, Madam President, my plea is that before we go into recess, let us take up at least the issues affecting state and local government and do something to help so that they can continue to provide essential services to our constituents, so they can deal with the direct costs associated with COVID-19 in their communities. As we are beginning to reopen our communities, we need to make sure our state and local governments have the resources to respond to the challenges when more people are getting together. And we also need to respond if we're going to get our economy back on track. It's not going to get back on track with our state and local governments laying off their workers. We need to respond in a positive way, and we need to do that now. I urge my colleagues to take up legislation before we go into recess in order to help the people of our nation through our state and local governments. With that, Madam President, I would suggest the absence of a quorum.